Welcome to our Bible study. There's sometimes when we just outsmart ourselves. Last April, we had a Bible study of Acts 3, and it was most of that chapter, and yet I chose to focus on just the first 3 verses, not knowing that this April we would have a passage that would be Acts 3, just the first 3 verses. So today will be a little bit of review, but I've added some different stuff, and I think it's worth repeating because this is a surprising passage. At first glance, it looks like there's nothing to learn, and then we learn so much. So let me share with you Acts 13, 1 through 3. Now in the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a childhood friend of Herod the ruler, and Saul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul, and Saul for the work to which I have called them." Then after fasting and prayer, they laid their hands on them and sent them off. It's a very short story about the first missionary journey that Saul takes, Barnabas and Saul take, or at least the beginning of that missionary journey. But it also has so much in there, in all those names. You are probably well aware, Shakespeare said, "A rose by any other name would smell the same." It doesn't matter what somebody's name is, they're going to still be the same person, and that is true. But names can also tell us a lot. And so I want to go through each one of the names in these 3 verses and talk about them and what we think we know about them, and then draw some implications for us. And the first name is Barnabas. And I've talked about him before. I just love Barnabas, and I love the name Barnabas. You may remember, Bar just means son of. And so anytime you see the word Bar in the Bible, that's somebody who's a son of. And so we have Simon Bar Jonah, and that would be Simon the son of Jonah, and that was Peter. Jesus was never referred to this way in the Bible, but he would have been called Jesus Bar Joseph, because Joseph was his earthly father. And you can play that game with yourself as well. My name is Courtney, of course, so I would be Courtney Bar Richard, because my father is Richard, and then you can play that game for you also. Well, Barnabas was not actually the son of a man named Encouragement, because the name Barnabas means son of encouragement. And we're told back in Acts 3 that his name is Joseph, but he was given the nickname Barnabas by the disciples because he was so wonderfully encouraging. Now, he is Joseph from Cyprus, and of course that's one of the other ways that people were identified in ancient days, was where they were from. And so he was known as Joseph from Cyprus, and that's going to become significant in a little bit. But he was nicknamed Barnabas, the son of encouragement, and he was. He was an incredible encouragement to Saul. Saul has this dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, and the disciples nevertheless are afraid of him. They know that he was a persecutor of the church, and who comes to his aid and his defense? It's Barnabas. And Barnabas speaks up for him, and Barnabas says, "I know what he used to do, but that's not who he is anymore." And time and again we see that Barnabas is a wonderful encouragement. Barnabas and Saul is the way that their names are listed in these first 13 chapters, and then actually the conversion of Saul doesn't happen until a few chapters back, but you always see Barnabas first, because initially Barnabas is the leader of this wonderful team, and Barnabas is sent from Jerusalem to Antioch to care for that church. And the first thing he does is he goes off to Tarsus, and he finds Saul, and he brings Saul back. And so it's always Barnabas and Saul until the end of this chapter, and then it flips and it becomes Paul and Barnabas, or Saul and Barnabas. And the flip is probably intentional, and it's wonderful. Barnabas early on needs to be the encourager. He needs to be the mentor. He has been in the faith longer. He needs to teach Saul. Saul needs to be his apprentice, if you will. But then later it becomes so obvious, as it even says in this passage, that God has selected Saul to be this amazing evangelist. And once he kind of gets his feet under him, Barnabas, the son of encouragement, agrees to give up first chair, if you will, to let Paul now be the leader, because he is now ready for that. And that's just a wonderful thing. A lot of people wouldn't do that. Someone who was less of an encourager and needed the credit for themselves, they would be much more likely to try to hang on to that. But Barnabas goes from Barnabas and Saul to Paul and Barnabas because the gospel was primary for him. That was what he wanted to see the most success in, not his own personal life, and he was content to give up his leadership for Paul. Well, the second name we have in there is Simeon, who is called Niger. And so his nickname really is Niger. Simeon, who was called Niger, just like Barnabas has the name, or excuse me, Joseph of Cyprus has the nickname Barnabas. Simeon has the nickname Niger. And Niger simply means dark or black. And so he was probably black skinned. Actually, that word Niger is where we get the pejorative N word that we sometimes hopefully do not use, but here used. That's not what they were calling him, or at least in the sense that they were using it. It was a nickname, maybe a little bit playful. He was a leader, however, in the church there at Antioch, and that's kind of all we know. But there is some fascinating guesses, suppositions about who he might be. Now, you may remember that Simon of Cyrene is the bystander that is standing on the side of the road when Jesus is carrying his cross, and when Jesus, who has been beaten so badly that he cannot continue to carry the cross, and he falls down, they just grab this guy from the side and make him carry the cross, and that was Simon of Cyrene. And there's an interesting little detail there. Mark tells us that he's just a bystander. He just happens to be in Jerusalem. He's almost certainly a faithful Jew there in Jerusalem for the Passover. He's come from Cyrene, which is down in Africa. And so he could very well have been a dark-skinned person. And he's grabbed from the side of the road. And yet Mark says that he was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, how did Mark know who this person was? How did he know all these details about this bystander, this random person? Well, maybe he knew because Simon of Cyrene later becomes Simeon of Niger, a Christian and a leader in the church in Antioch. One thing we know about the church in Antioch is that it was founded and led by people from Cyrene. Simon of Cyrene was one of them, or possibly one of them. It was Simeon of Cyrene, the same as Simeon of Niger, the same as Simeon of Cyrene. We don't know, but let's speculate. And now we're moving completely into speculation. We are Simon from Cyrene. I'm confusing Simeon and Simon here. We are Simon from Cyrene. We're in Jerusalem for the Passover. We hear all this commotion. We go out to see what is going on, and they are making this man carry his cross up to Golgotha. And you're just standing there, maybe with your children, Alexander and Rufus. And you are watching what is going on, and the man falls down, and all of a sudden a Roman soldier grabs you and pushes you in and forces you to carry the cross. Now, this is humiliating. This is not something you would volunteer to do. And again, he is probably a faithful Jew. He's there for the Passover. As soon as he picks up that cross, he's going to get Jesus' blood on him. And that's going to make him unclean because blood was considered to be unclean. And so now he's here for the Passover and he's unclean. His clothes have blood on them, and his clothes are possibly ruined. It would have been a very rough-hewn cross, and so it's probably got splinters. And so they're going to be ripping the clothes, maybe even sticking him as well. And so he is bruised up, his clothes are torn up, and he's forced to carry this cross. He is probably angry, he's frustrated, and he has no choice but just to do this. And yet, what happens? He gets up to where they're going to crucify Jesus, and they begin to crucify Jesus. And he hears Jesus pray, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." Or maybe even as he's carrying the cross up the way, does Jesus say something to him? Make him intrigued. And so he pays attention, and he pays attention. This isn't just some random thing that happened on Friday and it's over, but all of Jerusalem on Sunday is buzzing about what is going on. And Passover would have been 7 days, and so he would have been there into that next week as well. And everyone is hearing these stories of the one that was crucified on Friday is now being said to have been raised from the dead. And so maybe Simeon called Niger, or Simon from Cyrene, if they're the same person, go and seek out the disciples and say, "Tell me more about this man." And he not only then becomes the one who bears Jesus' cross, literally taking up the hill, but he becomes one who is a Christian, who follows Jesus' command to pick up your cross and follow me. We get one more little example of that, perhaps, or one more little wonder about that. As Paul is greeting the Romans, he says, "Greet Rufus and his mother." And again, we're speculating. But if these people, if Simeon and Simon are the same person, perhaps by the time Paul is writing to the Romans, he's died, maybe even has become a martyr. And Rufus is in Rome with his mother, and Paul is saying, greet them, because your dad or your husband was so important to me when I was there in Antioch. He was a good friend, a wonderful colleague in the gospel, and so let me greet them. And Rufus appears there. Maybe that is the same Rufus who was the son of Simon, and he became a Christian because his father became a Christian. Under his father's influence, he became a Christian. It's a wonderful, wonderful speculation, and it is a wonderful way for us to consider the ways that others, we ourselves or others, become Christians. And sometimes it is by going through very difficult things or undergoing things that we didn't want to undergo, and maybe in some instances it is Christians help us. Christians were there for us when others weren't there for us during those difficult times, or just some difficult time for one reason or another led you to Christ. Simon wasn't there in Jerusalem looking for Christ, and yet he finds himself drug into Christ's presence, and perhaps eventually found himself a Christian as well. Well, the next one in line in the name is Lucius of Cyrene. And so Cyrene pops up again, possibly. We have Simon of Cyrene there in Jerusalem, and perhaps he then becomes Simeon called Niger. Now we have Lucius of Cyrene, and we do know that it was people from Cyrene, which was in Africa, that founded the church in Antioch. And the church in Antioch, we should mention, it becomes an incredibly important church for the church universal. So the Jerusalem church is kind of home base, and that's kind of the central church, and yet its counterpart, if you will, is Antioch, and it is a counterpart, in that it is the church that is comprised mostly of Gentiles. And in just a couple of chapters, they will send Barnabas and Paul and others to Jerusalem to say, what are we supposed to do with Gentile converts? Some say that we should circumcise them, some say we shouldn't, and they have the big Jerusalem conference. It's because these two churches were just so important. And it was at Antioch, talking about nicknames, where Christians were first called the name Christian. And the word Christian simply means little Christ. And so they were people pejoratively called, well, they just think they're little Christ, they're little Messiahs. But today we see ourselves as we are diminutive. We are not Christ. We don't have a Messiah complex, but we want to be Christ-like. We want to follow Christ. We want to pattern our lives after Christ. And so in that sense, we are little Christs. That comes from Antioch. And if it were not for Cyrene, there might not be any Antioch. And so we have Lucius of Cyrene. That's all we know about this person, except that Lucius is the very formal Latin spelling or version of the Greek word or name Lucas, which is, of course, also the word or the name Luke. And so it might be that Luke, who is writing the book of Acts, is here using a different version of his name here in the book of Acts. And maybe the folks at Antioch kind of used that as a nickname for him. They called him this highfalutin name, Lucius. He's the doctor, he's the writer, and hopefully not in a pejorative way, but rather in a fun, lighthearted way. They just called him Lucius, like some people might call a Dr. Doc or a Reverend Rev or whatever, just as a way of being lighthearted, not pejorative necessarily, but lighthearted. And he includes that in here. And if that is the case, we do need to be aware that Luke often gives us little clues in Acts about times when he was present and times when he wasn't. And so if you read Acts carefully, you'll note that sometimes Luke will say they did this. And actually in this passage, he is saying they. And we presume that when he says they, he's talking about something that happened that he wasn't present for. But there's other times in Luke when all of a sudden that changes and it goes from they to we. And it's not that Luke got confused, it's that Luke is now telling us about some event where he was present for. Because this is not just something that he researched at some later time and wrote about, but these were events that he was active and present in, at least some of them. And so we can tell between they and we. And we see here that perhaps, though, Lucius is Luke. Well, the next character we come across is Manaen, and Manaen is another one of these characters that we know very little about, but we can do a little bit of speculation. Manaen is listed in the translation that I read a moment ago as a childhood friend of Herod. What we speculate, scholars speculate, is that he actually was almost a foster brother to Herod. He was probably brought up in the palace with Herod, and we don't know what happened, what the conditions were that caused him to kind of be the foster son of Herod's parents and Herod's foster brother. But he grows up there in the palace, and yet somehow he becomes a Christian. And we know that in spite of the fact that the church in Jerusalem remains and it is still kind of the power central, if you will, we also know that when the persecutions happened, that the Christians scattered. And the reason that Saul goes to Damascus is that they have scattered to Damascus. Antioch is someplace else that they went. And perhaps even this foster brother of Herod, presumably he had a good relationship with Herod. They were friends, they were brothers, but when he became a Christian, all of that changed. And although Herod's only real persecution of Christ is to allow the crucifixion to happen and to send Christ to Pilate for trial, Herod does nothing to advocate for Christ, and it may be that when the persecution started, Herod is perfectly happy to persecute Christians, and so even his friend Manaen has to flee to Antioch. But one of the things that this tells us about him is that his identity as a Christian was more important than his identity as a Roman, that his identity as someone who was powerful and in the court, as his identity as a friend of Herod. He was a Christian first and foremost, and that is powerful for us. Oftentimes people will attach themselves to someone of power, or they will seek some position of power, and that becomes more important than their identity as a Christian, and we should all avoid that. And Manaen here clearly avoids that, as he is almost a refugee up there in Antioch, but he does that because he wants to be faithful first and foremost. Well, then we come to the most prolific New Testament writer, perhaps the greatest evangelist of all time, Saul, who also will be known as Paul. And we get this wonderful shift in Saul, who is, of course, the persecutor of the church and then becomes a Christian. He always says, I was chief of all sinners. He never forgets that he's the persecutor of Christ, but he also is always so incredibly thankful for the grace that he has given. And we owe Paul so much for not just the concept of grace, but for the experience of grace that he had, that he then offers to us. Now, you may know that Saul is a Hebrew name and Paul is a Greek name. It actually would have been Paulus. And it's almost this deal when he goes on this first missionary journey, and they will initially go to Cyprus, and that's important because Barnabas is Joseph of Cyprus, and Barnabas and Saul here in this passage are set apart to go, and they go to Cyprus. They go to Barnabas's home island, to his home place. That's the first place they go, and when they go, Paul's name or Saul's name shifts over to Paul, and this is an indication that he recognizes that he is going to be a minister to the Gentiles. Now, everywhere he goes, he starts in the synagogue. He doesn't abandon the Jews, and yet he is always more successful with the Gentiles. He has more converts with the Gentiles, and so that becomes sort of his focus, even though he never ever forgets about the Jews, and writes very eloquently, particularly in Romans, about them, even saying that he would undergo eternal persecution if that would allow his people, the Jewish people, to come to Christ. And so he doesn't forget them, but he becomes Paul because he recognizes that it is the Gentiles that are responding more than the Jews are to the message that he is giving. And so it's wonderful that we have here in the church at Antioch all of these people, and yet they don't rest on their laurels. The church is growing, it's thriving there in Antioch, but they, through worship and prayer and fasting, recognize we're now called to send out missionaries. And that's a wonderful thing too, if you think about it, because here's a place where missionaries were sent to when they fled from Jerusalem. They went to Antioch, and they were a missionary church there, a church plant, if you will, and it grew so much that it began sending out missionaries. There are many places where in the past 150 or 200 years we have sent missionaries who are now sending missionaries back to the United States. As the church is shrinking in the United States, there are places where the church is growing in Africa, in Latin America, and elsewhere, and they are now sending missionaries back to us because we are in need. That's kind of what Antioch does as well. They realize now that we have been blessed, we need to be a blessing to others. And so I want us to think of a few implications for us. And the first implication is that it really doesn't matter what your name is. It really doesn't matter where you're from. But there are ways that you can take your name, you can take where you're from, take your identity, and use it for the gospel. And so we have Simon of Cyrene and Lucius of Cyrene. They are from Cyrene, and yet they go to Antioch and they do their work, and yet they're always identified back with Cyrene. And we're not quite sure why that was important to them, but there was something that happened there in Cyrene that kept them kind of connected in there a little bit, if you will. Saul, of course, takes his story, both his story of being a zealous Jew persecuting the church, and then his story about being converted on the road to Damascus and all that happens, and he uses all of the things that happened to him for the gospel. And we can do the same thing as well and recognize that even the things we've done that have been sinful, when we have learned from them, when we experience Christ's grace, we can then use them for the good of the gospel. And so how is it that you can take where you've been, what you've done, what has happened to you, what you've done both good and bad, and use those for the sake of the gospel? I think it's very powerful to recognize that in this passage they discover that they need to send out missionaries because they are worshiping and fasting and praying. Things don't just happen by accident. We are so guilty of assuming that, well, I made a profession of faith when I was 9 years old or 12 years old or 30 years old or whatever, and now I'm just kind of waiting, biding my time until I inherit eternal life. That's not the life we're called to. We are called to continue to worship and pray, to seek God's will each and every day and for each and every phase of our lives. What is God calling you to do now? And if you don't know, the answer is worship and pray and even fast, something that's not real popular with us these days, but fast and ask God, what do you want from me? And rather than being afraid of that, and most of us I think are a little bit afraid, well, I don't want him to send me to Antioch or to someplace else. Let us recognize that wherever God sends us, to whomever God sends us, it will be with great joy. I also want to note that all of these people, when they are sent, and I think this is one of the reasons that we are so afraid of witnessing, we see witnessing, unfortunately, in a more modern sense that I think is not a good sense. So, well, if I hand people out a tract on the street, or I've got a big sign up and I'm holding it, or I'm a street preacher on the street, that is witnessing, and we just don't want anything to do with that. And I'll confess, I don't want anything to do with that. But more often, evangelism is relational evangelism. Go back to Simon/Simeon. Now, he doesn't really have a relationship with any of those people. We don't know his story, but he doesn't become a Christian simply by watching Jesus be crucified. He had to go and talk to people, and people were able to accept him and care for him and teach him. If you think about the way that you became a Christian, it probably wasn't through a stranger who approached you on the street, but it was somebody you had a relationship with, maybe a mother or father or a family member, maybe a pastor, maybe a friend, but it's a relationship. And so we are called to be witnesses to those that we have relationships with. And though I think it does mean that we are called to develop relationships with people who aren't Christians. And first and foremost, we love them first. It's not that they have this big target on them and we think it's our job to make them a Christian. It's our job, I like to say, to get them from A to B, from not believing in God to maybe wondering, is it possible that there is a God? God uses lots of different people. It took Simon from Cyrene, assuming he became Simeon, called Niger. It took him meeting lots of different people, getting him along the way. But all those little steps happened, and eventually he became a Christian. Likewise, really, even for Saul, even though it all happened, it seems in an instant, he was making his way there without him even perhaps fully realizing it. It may be just your job to take for a person to get one step, but that one step is vitally important, because if they don't take that step, they can't take the next one. I like to sometimes say that we need to recognize that everybody we encounter, whether they're a Christian or not, when we leave them, they're going to be either a little closer to Christ or a little bit further away from Christ. And it's our job to make sure they're a little bit closer to Christ. And that's a heavy burden. You're driving on the road and somebody cuts you off. How do you respond? You see something on Facebook that makes you mad. How do you respond? Somebody says something to you and you want to really tell them off. How do you respond? Or you're just in the grocery store line and you encounter the clerk. How do you treat that person? At the end of that encounter, they're either a little closer to Christ or a little further away. And like I said, that is a burden. But when we begin approaching life that way, we also see it as a wonderful opportunity. And we don't have to be obnoxious about it. We don't have to even speak a word about Christ to them to be able to do this. And so I invite you to think about that. So what's in a name? Maybe not very much, maybe a whole lot, but what we do know is that God calls each one of us. And I want to leave you with this wonderful little thing as we're thinking about nicknames. In the book of Revelation, in the 2nd chapter, to the church of Pergamum, the angel tells John to write and say that God says to them, I give to everyone who is one of mine a white stone, and on it is a name that only they know. And what is going on there is, in the ancient world, a ticket essentially was a stone that would have written on there your name. And you would take that stone and present it, if you were going to a dinner, perhaps a very fine dinner, present it to the servant there at the door, and you'd be allowed into the house. If you're going to some event, you would be able to hand them that stone, and your name is on there, and that gives you entry. Here, God is saying, I have a nickname for each and every one of the people who are mine. And that's just a special relationship that just the two of us have. And for all who are faithful, I give them a stone. And of course, that gives us entry into God's kingdom. And so as we depart from this lesson, know that just as those there in Antioch had nicknames and were known in very special ways, God knows you in that special, special way. And that gives you the opportunity to go out and be on mission for this wonderful God.